Well, now I want to introduce Clay Parnell. Clay and I go way back, and Clay basically jumped ship on me. So he was working for Belk when I asked him to do the program, and then he left and he went to Parker Avery, which is a consulting group. But I wanted Clay to tell you the story of Belk and merchandising and give you a flavor for what's happening in the retail world. The retail world's a pretty tough world, and we see that, you know, they're probably one of the most out of balance verticals that we study. And so as we look at transformation in retail and we look at the impact on what's happening on e-commerce and what's happening on really driving that customer experience, I think Clay's got a lot of wonderful insights. But I'll give you a little bit of personal story about Clay. I actually met Clay when I was implementing supply chain planning about 15 years ago. We were both at the same client trying to implement supply chain planning 15 years ago, and now we have the same stage. So Clay, where are you? Come on up. Oh, you're hiding behind my my picture. Come on up. Thank you very much. Now, I didn't tell him all the stories of when we first started working together, so I'll let you tell them.
Some things stay within the cone of silence, right? Just to add a little bit more color to that, when Laura and I met, it was in scenic Bowling Green, Kentucky, and we were trying to help Fruit of the Loom make underwear. She was with Manugistics, I was with a consulting firm, Kurt Salmon Associates. And we had a kickoff meeting, and then a couple days later, there was a big Manugistics team, there was a big KSA team, and the Fruit of the Loom executive says, you know what, stop, we're not ready to kick this off yet. Everybody go home. Well, except for Laura and Clay. You guys stay here, and over the next 2 months, you help put together the plan about what we're going to do. And we did that, and that's when Laura and I really became friends and got to know each other. So, and that was 17 years ago, by the way. I'm really excited to be here, and I've really gotten a lot out of the last couple of days. There's a lot of themes that I'm going to try to tie into one of the discussions. One quick theme, there's been some discussion over the last couple of days about education and training and making supply chain, you know, a true methodology and getting. So when Laura and I met, I had two little girls, and they were 2 and 4 at the time. They actually came and visited me a couple times in Bowling Green. They're now in college, and they're both at Georgia Tech in engineering. One is majoring in industrial engineering with a minor in supply chain, and the other one's majoring in biomedical engineering. So fortunately, they got their smarts from their mother. Anyway, one of the things I heard really loud and clear yesterday, and it's humbling to follow supply chain excellence from Colgate based on what we heard yesterday about where supply chain is in retail. Supply chain in retail is behind in several ways, and I'm going to touch on a few of those as I talk about the transformation at Belk. And one of the reasons can be tied to this, which is retailers tend to be driven by merchants, and merchants are all about the product, and they're all about the assortment. How it gets to the store and how it gets to the consumer, many leaders in retail could care less. So it really starts about that tone at the top, I think, is one of the things that we heard yesterday. And that's not that there aren't great supply chain people in retail. There's some super talent in retail supply chain. But the tone from the top is get the right product, get the right assortment, get it in the store. You guys figure out the rest. And so that's something that's evolving. That's something that's not the same at every retailer. And again, not all retail is created equal. It's hard to compare, I'm just going to say, basic commodity-driven retail, Walmart, Costco, grocery, et cetera, with very fashion-oriented retail, Victoria's Secret, Tiffany's, others. Anyway, they're very different animals and beasts. The other piece that Philippe touched on yesterday was the focus on the triangle for retail is a lot about inventory. So the balancing act between inventory turns, operating margin, and return on working capital in retail is a tenuous one. And again, it's different between the type of retail, but if you're a fashion retailer, it's all about picking the product, making the buy, and making sure you can sell it at that right margin. So it's tough. Another issue in retail If anybody's worked in retail, you've heard of the retail method of accounting, retail math, versus cost accounting. And a lot of it has to do with most retail has a lot of SKUs, a lot of inventory spread out throughout their supply chain between DCs, warehouses, and stores. And so along the way in the history of retail, retail accounting basically allows you to average the value of your inventory across your enterprise. It's a method of simplifying the math, and it made sense 50, 60, 70 years ago. It may not necessarily make sense in today's world, but it still exists in a big way. And having shortcuts like that just tend to exacerbate other issues in retail. When I first started putting this presentation together, the theme was around transformation, innovation, and change. And when I joined Belk department stores, and I'll tell you a little bit more about Belk in a minute, a few years ago when I first met Tim Belk and the executive team, I had to be convinced of two things. Number one, they were really willing to make the investment of what they were going to have to do to go through a true transformation. Belk had a reputation in the industry of being sleepy, not innovative, not investing, somewhat behind the times. And I had to make sure that they were going to really make that investment in order for me to make that career move. And they convinced me, and they did in a big way, and I'll touch on that investment in a minute. The second thing that I was looking for confirmation on was that they really understood the transformation that they were going to take the organization through, the pain that they were going to take the organization through. I had to make sure that they understood it was more than just plugging in a new system, that it was really about changing the processes, changing the roles, changing the organization, really standing them upside down. And they said they got it, but they didn't really get it. And so what it really came down to, kind of the new subtitle that we all talked about there, was blood, sweat, and tears. And no, there wasn't really any blood, but it's very hot and humid in Charlotte, North Carolina. So there was a lot of sweat, and I did see my share of tears. So let's talk a little bit more about Belk and what it is. If you're not from the Southeast, you may not have ever heard of Belk. Belk is the U.S.'s largest family-owned, full-line department store. Last year, Belk celebrated its 125th anniversary, has 300 stores in 16 Southeast states, and last year crossed the $4 billion in sales mark. From a complexity standpoint, the interesting thing is that Belk has stores in major metropolitan areas, Atlanta, Charlotte, Raleigh, Dallas, that have very large stores. If you walked into it and didn't see anything, you could be in a Macy's. So they are as large as 300,000 square feet. And then they have stores that are more like I would call their historical model, which are in rural areas that are about 50,000 square feet. You walk in those, you would think you were in a small Kohl's. So if you start thinking about the complexity of managing those different environments, thinking about the assortment differently, the consumer and the segmentation differently, it's complicated. From a SKU complexity standpoint, if you think about a department store, I can go in and buy a suit, a shirt, a pair of shoes. I can go in and buy a Keurig coffee maker. I can go in and buy jewelry, cosmetics. There's about 250,000 styles in a large department store. And a style is this suit or this shirt. But if you start breaking it out into colors and sizes, this suit and this shirt can come in different patterns, et cetera. It gets up to about 800,000 SKUs in a large store or online. And then if you break that out into, obviously, multiply it out by the location level, the store level, which is how people tend to plan in retail, it gets to be a pretty hairy beast of complexity. Belk's done pretty well over the last few years. On a comp store basis, Belk was able to outperform their peer group 3 years in a row. And that's overall, and that's looking at stores. And as you can see, that's comparing to some of the best in the industry. Obviously, take JCPenney off because they really struggled over the years. But Belk was doing very well. But that kind of hides some of the challenges that they had. And one of the things that was very clear when I joined Belk, and I think we started doing some really good thinking, was what did we aspire to be and why did we think we needed to transform if we actually thought we were doing pretty well? And actually, when you start to look at other types of sales, the answer is pretty clear. Belk was really just starting their online presence about 4 or 5 years ago. So in 2011, they were nowhere. And then it just came down to a series of questions. What do we want to do? Well, omnichannel was just starting to creep up. We knew we wanted to do that. We knew we wanted to ramp up e-commerce. But we also knew that we couldn't do that without working on the foundation. And again, that's one of the key themes over the last couple of days. And Belks Foundation, while it could support the existing business, could not support growth. Belk was operating on mainframe COBOL-based systems that were truly developed and deployed at Belk when Richard Nixon was president. So I literally looked at the code that was running in production. I didn't look at the code. I looked at the documentation. But it was deployed in 1971 and 1972, and that's what they were running the business on. And so we knew that there were some things that were going well, but there were some things that we just had to fundamentally look at. So we launched what we called a digital journey. We knew we had to start ramping up e-commerce, and in parallel at the same time, we had to focus on the foundation. And only if we did those two could we really start talking about omnichannel. And at this point, again, it's 2011, we already knew we were behind. But the fact that we were behind, we weren't in a great economic situation. But the great thing at that time about being a privately held company is that Tim Belk and his brother Johnny Belk and the board could say, this is what we're going to do. And by the way, I know I've left Belk, but everything I'm sharing now is public record. I've presented it before. Tim Belk presented some of this actually at NRF about a year ago. So it's nothing here is proprietary. When I talk about the foundation, what does that mean? That means in 2011, when I joined, we literally, within a week of joining, we kicked off a software selection. We looked at software that was called, we'll call it core merchandising, so it's the foundation backbone system. When we looked at a number of systems, SAP, Oracle, JDA, and others. We looked at some optimization software, forecasting, planning, size and pack optimization. So in those areas, we looked really at Oracle and SAS were the two players, and we were looking at product information management because we knew that while we were replacing a lot of our older backbone systems, we were going to need kind of that core single version of the truth, if you will. And there was also a lot of infrastructure that the IT group needed to look at, and I'm not even going to begin to get into that. So what you see here is basically what is in that core merchandising and the optimization suite. So over the course of 2.5 years, we had to replace our master data, demand forecasting, merchandise planning, replenishment, new data warehouse, size and pack optimization, allocation, purchase order, inventory, stock ledger, invoice match, et cetera. So we chose the software. We kicked it off in fall of 2011. We had our first deployment in the summer of 2012, and we had our last deployment in November of 2013. And why a retailer would go live with anything in November, we'll talk about later. I'm not going to get into that. So we did all that, and we learned a lot of lessons. And I just wanted to touch on a few of them here. The first one is you have to assess the organization's maturity. And part of it is what's their historical readiness to do something like this, because they may have not done something like this, but are they ready for it now? And to do that, you have to make sure the executive leadership is not only bought into it, but they're out front leading. They're not saying, Clay, go up on stage and tell people what you're going to do to them. They're actually standing with you and in front of you helping take the shots, because you're going to get a lot of shots. The second is, are you prepared for the cost? You've got to really know the true CapEx number you think is going to be out there, and you probably need to add a significant contingency. I can tell you that the budget that they had identified when I walked in the door versus what we spent, it probably increased by 100% over the course of a couple years. And it's just clear learning, and it's clear understanding what else you're going to spend money on. And it's not the software, and some of it's consulting, but it's just a lot of additional cost, time, and complexity. Do you have the IT team in place to deliver it? That was one of our key challenges at Belk. Again, we had some great IT people, but a few years before this, they had outsourced a good part of their IT group. So when I walked in the door, $4 billion company, our IT group was about 50 people. And that's not nearly as large as it needs to be. It's almost, well, more than doubled, may have tripled by the time I left. But they just depended on a lot of consulting partners, contract associates, both onshore and offshore. And really understanding the IT team's delivery capabilities isn't just about people, but it's understanding that as you're going through a transformation like this and you need IT partnership, they also have to keep the lights on. They have to support systems that are out there because those are still running at the same time. Number 4, do your partners have skin in the game? And this can be a couple of different ways. Number 1, the partners that are helping you in this journey, the ones that are in the foxhole with you, are they really committed to what this takes? The other part is, again, for a retailer, your partners are your vendors. They're the ones that have to understand what you're doing and why you're doing this. And I'll touch on some of this as we move forward, but a lot of it has to do with the fact that you're going to change things that are going to have implications for them, and they're going to have to do things differently, and they may have to invest as well along the way. And that can be challenging, and it takes time. And then finally, change management. I can talk about the team that I had when I walked in there. I basically asked to get people pulled out of the business. I ended up getting 15 full-time people out of the business that were on my team. They were former planners, VPs of planning, merchants, buyers, all basically pulled out of the business, assigned full-time to own pieces of this process and be the owners of those processes along the way. I also had a VP of change management that reported to me, and he had people on the team that owned communication and that owned a lot of the administration of our change management program. So it was something that hadn't been done before, and I can tell you that for the 2 years we were going through this program, our internal audit team did a risk profile across our company, and either the number 1 or number 2 risk during this entire program was all about what we were doing here. And it just meant that it was big, and it was hairy and audacious, and it had a lot of implications and tentacles throughout the company. But it was important because we wanted to get to omnichannel, and obviously omnichannel is a big buzzword, and it means a lot of different things to different people. And there's a couple slides I've got here on what omnichannel meant to Belk and means to Belk. I already touched on wanting to transform the e-commerce experience. That was important. We can't forget about transforming the in-store experience. Everybody thinks, you talk about omnichannel and it's all about what's online and what you're doing with delivery, but people are putting new things in the store, and there are different experiences in the store, and those are important too. And especially important for understanding the different experiences that we need based on our different types of stores. Expanding mobile, making sure that when somebody walks into the store, they can do something different, they can operate differently with you. Integrating customer data. This was a huge area of opportunity for us. Again, only in the Southeast, we had a lot of loyal customers, but we know very little about our most loyal customers. And from a customer service standpoint and getting to that next level, we had to figure out a way, or start figuring out a way, to really leverage that data. And then establishing enterprise inventory. And this is when it really gets interesting from a supply chain standpoint, because a lot of the foundational elements that we talked about really had to be there for the enterprise inventory. They may not have had to be there for some of these other pieces, but for enterprise inventory, it was critical. And this is when it really started to get interesting. I don't want to spend a lot of time on our vision we laid out. This really helped us paint a picture, especially for our store executives and others throughout the business, about what omnichannel was going to mean. And the interesting thing that I always come back to, that I was very proud that we got right, was what's in the middle there, was the one consistent, compelling customer experience. You can paint all the other things around it, and that's great, but again, put yourself in the shoes of the shopper. We are the most demanding, most rigid people out there because we have certain expectations of what we want. And it's important as you put these building blocks in place to put your customer's hat on and figure out what you think they're going to want. So one example, when I talk about the enterprise inventory, and this is true for a lot of retailers today, has to do with marrying up that demand and that supply picture. So the generate demand side is pretty straightforward. It's when somebody goes into a store or goes online, how do I make sure I can close that deal? And they may be in a store and they can't find the size they're looking for, they can't find the color they're looking for, and I need to have options. Or they could go online, and I might not want to tell the customer that I don't have any in my fulfillment center, but I'm going to go out and find it. And that's where we really had to focus on what we called improving the store fulfillment. And you hear a lot about other retailers doing this. It's difficult in a department store environment depending on how you have your store labor set up, to have people there ready and able to pick inventory and ship it to a customer. But that's what we started to do. We started started with a limited number of our stores, actually setting up a program where if somebody wanted it online or wanted it in a different store, we could find it in another store. And it was a challenge for us, again, going back to that enterprise inventory, but we started tackling it in a pilot mode and learning from it, and it made a big difference. And many of you, again, putting Belk aside, you may shop today and you may buy a couple things online, and you may realize you get 2 boxes instead of 1, and if you look at it, they come from 2 different locations. And it could come from a fulfillment center in a store, it could come from 2 different stores. And I've seen it myself when I'm shopping online as well. And there's a lot of, you can put as much complexity into it as you want. The first thing is just find the inventory and ship it. But once you have the capability, you can also start putting different logic around it as far as, find the inventory that's perhaps closest to the customer or where they want it shipped, or you can say find the inventory wherever it is the most so that I can get it out of that store so I can avoid markdowns. So that, again, there's different logic you can put around it. So, again, we focused on the foundation, and it was to allow us to then build on and do the more interesting thing. So the foundation, to me, that was just kind of the table stakes. That's the requirements. It's what can I do? And this is where we laid out those basic item capabilities. I can define an item. I can put a price to it. I can figure out what size and what pack I want to purchase it in. I can plan it, replenishment, allocate it to the stores. Those are just the building blocks. Then that gives you the flexibility in an omnichannel world to decide, what do I want to do? And those are the options. And again, this is where Belk or other retailers get to define what it means to them. So how do I view my consumer? What kind of information do I have, and how do I leverage that? How do I know how she wants to shop, what her preferences are, and what kind of capabilities she's looking for, whether it's online, mobile, or in a store? How our consumer views us, where they look at our information. Oh, and by the way, am I okay with them doing showrooming in my store? How do I not shirk away from it and actually try to leverage it and provide them better information to meet them halfway? What is my assortment? This is huge. This is what it really means to a merchant. And this is where you, again, come back to partnering with your vendors, because what the assortment is may be beyond what's in your store. If you're shopping online, you may be able to then present options to your consumers that you don't even carry in inventory, but your vendors have it. So you get to extend your assortment and thereby get even increased sales without the inventory investment. And then considering inventory and serving my customer. And I'll touch on these a little bit as I'm closing up. So I had a few more lessons, and these are similar extensions of the first 5, but they're either new or they're a little bit deeper or just perhaps a little bit more subtle, but it goes from lessons on the foundation side more to lessons on the omnichannel side. The first is the scale of the change is big and it's different. And it may not be a larger change, but it touches more people. So if you think about the foundational change to a great degree, kind of focuses on the back office. It's the people at the headquarters. It's the people that are kind of running the business. Once you get out into the omnichannel world, you're touching the stores and you're starting to touch the consumers directly. And this is where, again, it's a risk-reward, right? The reward is you give them more options, you give them more flexibility, you put some things out there that delight them, and you really capture them, and you increase your sales. The risk is you put some things out there that fail or don't work, or your website crashes 2 Thanksgiving Black Fridays in a row, hypothetically. And then you lose the sale, and you lose that customer relationship. So again, risk reward. But in today's competitive environment, I think the realization is you've got to go after the reward, and you've got to try to mitigate whatever risks you can. The next one is the organizational and incentive challenges. And again, in retail, if you think about the people in the stores, they're thinking, many of them are compensated based on their sales. And they see a focus on online sales, and they're saying, well, wait a minute, what does this mean to me? And you're selling it online, but you want me to ship it out of my store. So you start to get into pay questions. So this is something that's got to be addressed head on, and this is something that has to be communicated so that everybody understands you're not taking away their slice of the pie, you're just making the pie bigger. But again, because of the first issue around the scale is big and touches so many people, you've got to touch on any HR or incentive impacts, anything that touches compensation has to be considered. Customer service expectations, and in retail and anywhere really today, people have high expectations. My wife was shopping for a pair of blue jeans. This was about 15 years ago, maybe around the time I met Laura, I don't know. And there was the only store in Atlanta that sold them was Neiman Marcus, and I'd never been in Neiman Marcus. I'm not a Neiman Marcus shopper, but they were the only store at that time that carried Lucky jeans. And my wife wanted to get them for her brother, and her brother and I were about the same size, so I went and I tried them on. I'm like, okay, they'll fit, but I kind of like them too. I want to get a pair, but they only had one. And so the guy's like, okay, well, your choice. You take them and ship them to your brother, and we'll ship a pair to your home tomorrow for free. Well, that was Neiman Marcus. And on the other hand, on one hand, I don't expect everybody to do what Neiman Marcus does. On the other hand, I did after that. I did expect every retailer to do what Neiman Marcus does. Today's consumers are the same way. Once they see one retailer offering great customer service, options, flexibility, they expect it from everybody. So again, this is a huge challenge in a retail store, in an online model, and it has huge supply chain implications as well, because you're not dealing in cases, you're dealing in eaches. You're not dealing in pulling boxes off the warehouse. You're dealing with grabbing one thing out of a bag and throwing it into a box, either from the warehouse or from the store or what have you. So there's a lot of implications in the enterprise. Partner capabilities are critical. Now, this slide only shows shipping and transportation partners, but it's other partners as well. I mentioned the vendors, so Belk has private label brands, but they also buy from all the major brands out there. And when we were implementing our foundation, we had to make them change their EDI. We are asking them to put more in their item catalog, which defines attributes about the items. So we were asking them to do a lot, but we are also trying to communicate to them, here's what it's going to mean to Belk, and therefore here's what it's going to mean to you. We're going to have better information. It should increase our sales. It's going to increase your sales. So that collaboration is critical, but being able to translate into a value proposition for all parties was important. We touched on this, I think, at least a couple times yesterday around it's less about big projects. The foundation piece, that was a big project. You can break it down into its components, and we had multiple deployments. It wasn't big bang, truly, but it was more about big projects. I really think about Omnichannel as an umbrella that encompasses a number of different capabilities. People talk about Omnichannel. It means a lot of different things. You can list out 5 or 6 things or more about what Omnichannel is. I think it's about continuous improvement, identifying those things that you're going to get the most value for or you can do faster, and knowing that you're just going to keep refining that model. And it all falls under the umbrella of Omnichannel Improvement. And then finally, just understanding that it's not about stores and online and mobile. It's all about bringing that together and making sure you've got capabilities in your enterprise to support the full model, and knowing what it takes to have an engaged and truly delighted consumer. And that's it. Thank you.
So I'm so glad you didn't tell those Bowling Green stories. But everything that you've heard in the 2 days, what do you think is the most relevant for supply chain transformation of retail?
Certainly leadership and education are important. And it's not that it's that complex for people in retail that they won't get it. It's more of a focus, making sure they understand why it's important. Yes, buying the right product and having the right assortment is important, but it's just as important for the merchants to understand what goes on beyond, behind the curtain there.
Right.
They've got to understand what it means to get hands dirty and roll up your sleeves.
Yeah. Questions for Clay on retail, omnichannel, e-commerce. How about perpetual inventory signals? When do you think retailers will get those right?
Gosh.
That's the dirty little secret of the industry, right?
Yeah. I would love to be able to, throw RFID tags on every box of shoes and pair of jeans and everything else in a department store, but it's just not there yet. There are retailers that have been experimenting. Certainly in shoes is a big one, being able to tag and identify, shoes in the back room. Even from a customer service standpoint, it makes a big difference. And it may be easier in certain segments of retail than others. In a fashion retailer, it's just it's messy.
It's
messy.
it's really messy. Well, so were you surprised at the supply chain index data on retailers
No.
and the fact the retailers didn't make my list?
Not at all.
Not at all,
Not
right?
at all.
You would have predicted it, huh?
Yeah, I mean, you know, when I got out of school and started working for KSA, I spent my first couple years in textile manufacturing, and then I worked my way up the supply chain to apparel manufacturing, and then only then did I go into retail, and I've been shaking my head ever since.
You probably have a neck cramp.
Well,
huh?
it's, again, you listen to all the stories today. It's a humbling experience. On the other hand, I think there's just so much opportunity out there, and that's why it's exciting and it's fun. It's a fun place to be.
Well, thanks for joining us today.
Thank
you
you.
very much. Okay, we've got a half-hour break now, so we've got breaks set up outside, and then we're going to come back and we're going to talk about value networks. So we've got 2 value network case studies, one in hospitals and also one that we have in high-tech and electronics. So we'll see you back in a half hour. Thank you.